One of the most useful skills you can possibly have as an artist, regardless of if you're doing sculpting or texturing, whatever it might be, is the ability to observe. And here I'm not just talking about find a lot of good references and just kind of look at them. What I mean is like truly observing. In this video, we are going to go through a lot of the different tools we have in order for actually observing what we're looking at. We'll break down images and we'll talk about what you can look at. So you have to use reference for anything you're doing, at least as a general rule. And the reason is because our mental libraries are absolutely terrible. You think you know what something looks like, but then you were to go into a room and be there for a few hours, and then you're being asked what color is my t-shirt, and you can't even answer that. We have such terrible memories when it comes to anything visual. We have a vague recollection of what something looks like. You can always, recognize what a house looks like and all that. But if you're trying to use that exclusively as your mental library, it's just not going to work. You need to break up your mental library. And in order to do that, you need reference. And by reference, I mean something to look at. You need some kind of source for inspiration for the shape you're doing. This can be real world references. I have, for instance, a cast skull on my desk. I also have an anatomy figure on my desk, which is super useful. This can also be pictures you found online, or whatever it might be, as long as you have some kind of visual guide to help you make decisions. What's also important is that you realize that the reference you're gathering has specific use cases. The references you get is very unique to your problem. Are you trying to find references for the overall skin pores, for the layout of the bony landmarks, the color of the costumes, whatever it might be? You're going to have to find different images. Sometimes you can collect a mood board, which is just for the overall mood. And in that, you can have images of frogs and hats, even if you're doing a little mouse with a sword, just because it has the same mood. And sometimes you need incredibly specific references. Like if you are doing a mouse with a sword, you're going to have to find the references of a lot of mice and a lot of swords, because otherwise you just simply won't know what references or what those things will look like. This is one thing we used heavily in VFX. When I was working as a modeler and texture artist, we simply weren't allowed to actually show our work unless there was any reference there. And the reason was because it was so hard to see if you were on point or not. And also because otherwise it's just anyone's guess what something looked like. Sometimes you're doing something which is exactly the same as a reference, and it just doesn't look correct. So then you're going to have to interpret that as well. But at least by having reference, everyone is on the same page and they know that you've done a good job matching the reference. Another thing which is useful when it comes to references is you can start to use it to figure out how to tackle your problems. If you're looking at a project like this and you find a reference of maybe a man and a goat for the horns, you can start to really analyze the references and see how can you make this project. Maybe you start already to think about, okay, so I need some horns. Maybe I can get those pre-made from a modeling site or as 3D models. Maybe I can use a base mesh for the head. What resources do I need? For the skin, maybe it's going to be a pretty rough leathery skin. Okay, so I need some references of that as well to figure that out. And you can just start to block it out based on a reference. Basically, you're planning out your project based on a reference you have. For instance, if you're being told we need an octopus in a film, you're going to have to spend a lot of time really researching octopuses just because it's so specific. So the reference you get is incredibly important. It's also really important to look for specific references. Instead of just looking online for woman, you can search for Natalie Portman and you can find all sorts of images of this one person. It's also a bit dangerous to use too many references, at least if they're contradicting. If you're trying to sculpt like a woman and you have a million photos of Natalie Portman, that can be awesome because they're showing more of the same thing, meaning that you have more data on the same thing. But the problem is if you have photos of Natalie Portman and Jennifer Lawrence, they're going to have completely different features. So if you sculpt the nose of one of them in the beginning, then you switch between references, you're constantly having contradicting ideas. It's like if you were to look at references of color, and first you're looking at you're color picking something green, then next you're color picking something yellow, and then blue, and then pink. You need to stick to something specific and find a lot of references and a lot of ideas within that one field. It's also useful to go a bit deeper than just the first result. When I was doing character modeling, I would always try to go deeper than just the main brief. I was working on Pirates of the Caribbean some years ago, and one of my tasks there was to work up some sharks, some ghost sharks. And one was a hammerhead, another was a tiger shark, and then was a great white. So I spent a better part of a day just reading up on them, just looking at the Wikipedia articles for just first off shark, just to get a general idea. What are sharks like? How long do they live? Where do they live? All that. And then I found specific references, both visual references and also like descriptions of the other animals, just so I can figure out where they lived and just more info about them. And then once I found the references, then I would go really deep into each specific one. I would have like 30, 40 references of each shark from different angles, and just really proving that I could do it to the supervisors in terms of like, this looks, what I've done is what you want. But also it informed so many of my decisions. Like if you think you know what a hammerhead shark looks like and you're trying to do this without reference, it's gonna kind of resemble a hammerhead, but it's not gonna be good. It's not gonna have appeal, and it's gonna miss all the little fidelities which makes it look like a hammerhead. So a tool we use as well when it comes to references is one called PureRef. And it looks like this. This is a tool which is on top of the screen, and it's absolutely brilliant because now you can sculpt and you can have this on top of the screen, so you don't actually need two monitors. Even when I've had two monitors, I still find it to be way better to have PureRef open, because now it sounds lazy, but now I can just compare this eye to this eye, and I can just go one. I don't have to move my actual gaze from one monitor to another. So I can just compare these one to one right away. So even if you do have two monitors, I highly recommend having PureRef open like this. PureRef is spelled like this because nobody knows what I'm saying when I'm just saying PureRef. We've had so many problems with actual that, so it's spelled like this. So just Google that. It's a perfectly free software, and it's one software I would pay a lot of money for if it wasn't free. And then we can start to look at different references and how we can process them. When you're looking at something like this, which is a clay model of Simba, I believe these are maquettes which Disney makes for their movies, it's very hard to break this down, or if you do just by looking at this, because there's so much information. There is shading information, and there is lighting information, there is color information, all of that. So it depends what you want to do. If you're dealing with this for character designs, one of the most useful tools you can have is looking at the negative space. So the negative space is all the shapes in between. It can also be the silhouette, but it's also like the shapes in between the shapes. So we add a little bit of gray, just so we can neutralize that a bit. And here are examples of negative space. If you're just looking now at the shapes between here, this allows you to get really good and appealing shapes. So if you're trying to design this character, now you can really quickly figure out the shape language of Simba. You can see that right now we simplified it down that every single curve is very clear. They're very sharp curves. So there isn't any, you don't have a lot of like wobbliness like this from every angle. You have these incredibly sharp lines. So this makes your job a lot easier because now you generally know the shape language of the character. Some areas are really sharp, some areas are really soft, and some areas are sharp and soft like this, which is a straight to curve. So looking at negative space is a phenomenal exercise. Like I don't actually do it like this. I'm not actually breaking it down like this when I'm looking at reference, but this is a handy way of visualizing it. When I'm looking at negative space, I'm more doing this as a mental exercise, but it's still quite useful early on to properly break down the reference. Next, we have proportion. So here we have a really beautiful sculpt. And looking at this is pretty tricky to sculpt. Like we had in the sculpting techniques chapter or the sculpting workflow chapter, you can see here that this is beautiful when it comes to the bony landmarks. You can see bones here, you can see bones here, you can see bones around. You see the fat pads around here and around the breasts, and you see bony landmarks on our knees, and You see some muscles here and there, but in general, this is just so well done, which means if you're trying to replicate this, this is pretty tricky. And one of the best ways of starting out is by looking at proportion. So this is a general guide I've done where I'm just breaking it down into different segments. And now you can see where the general proportions are. You can see how long each area is like this. This also generally helps just to block down the volumes, just to very quickly see where the main shapes are. You just know what the main volumes are, and you can even translate this into the different views as well, just so you get a really clean idea of where they are. It's a fantastic idea to start to block something down like this, and then you can start to draw like a center line on top of it and all that kind of stuff, just to really understand the volume. But something like this is so complicated that it's very hard to just start looking at it. So we're breaking it into chunks where you can really focus on different elements is fantastic. In terms of proportion as well, we're also talking about the elements, like how are the elements arranged based on each other. So you can, for instance, see that this part is roughly the size of this part. This part is roughly the same size as this part. This part is the same as this. This part is, the same as these parts and all that. So this just helps you break it down. If you have something crazy stylized, this exercise might reveal a lot of very interesting things. For instance, that the forearms might be crazy large, and maybe the neck is incredibly thin and the head is massive. Whatever it might be, this just gives you a really good view of what your model looks like. Another one as well is using heads. Here I have just duplicated her head, and here you can see how many heads she is. Now, this is not often necessarily a problem when it comes to 3D, because we are so often just overlaying our images on top of the models directly, so you kind of get this for free, but it's still a good exercise just figuring out how many heads she is. If you want something to be more superhero, then generally it's advised to make the heads smaller. So if she's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 6.5 heads maybe. If you want her to feel really like a stylized supermodel, then you can make her head a lot smaller, which makes her feel taller as well. You can also make her torso a bit shorter and her legs a bit longer, same height, just changing the proportions, and that can have a dramatic effect. Another thing which helps as well in terms of proportion is you can draw out dots on the model. This is also like a fairly old school drawing technique, but now you can draw in the dots like for the mouth, like this, for the important landmarks like the nose and the eyes as well. And now you can easily compare this to your model. Like, is your model crazy out of proportion? Like, if you were to draw lines between this now, it's gonna change to disable pen pressure. So if we were to draw lines between these, you can now see the angles between them. So if this angle here was really like this in your model, then it wouldn't work at all. Like, then you have to move it way out. So doing triangulation like this can be really handy, because now you can really see the how different areas work together, like so. So I mean, essentially, if you were to triangulate something, now you can just really accurately see how the different proportions work together. Because now you can just straight up compare the angles. Or if you want to stylize it, you can also change these. You can make these a little bit smaller so the angle becomes like this, and you can really just control what you're looking at. So doing triangulation like this can be super useful as well. Then you have one of my favorite techniques, and that is to actually blur the image and do proper frequency separation. If you're looking at something like this, this is pretty tricky to sculpt. The thing is, the shapes aren't necessarily that complicated, but if you don't really know what to look for, you are going to be struggling. If you try to sculpt this now, you're going to be probably sculpting all of these insane shapes. You're really just focusing on all of this. So while you're sculpting the eyes, you might also, be sculpting every single little hair he has or she has. I don't know if this is a mama or papa bear. And then we can just focus on all of this. So this is what a lot of beginners will do. This is how, it's not just how they're drawing or sculpting. This is how they're actually, their mind processes the information. And this gets very messy very fast, because if you were to sculpt this as the first pass sculpting, we are now starting to realize that we have forgotten something. What happened to the skeleton? What happened to the muscle? What happened to this fat? And what happened to the skin? Well, it's not here. You can't see it. So now if you try to sculpt this, you are just purely sculpting the most high frequency detail. You know, all the tiny little hairs and all of that. So how can we do this? Well, one way is to just blur the living crap out of everything. So you can just duplicate the layer, desaturate it. Then we can go to filter, blur, and we can just blur it. And we can just blur it a lot. Now, I've already done this a few times with different frequencies. And now you can see that you can't, if you're looking at this and trying to sculpt it, you actually can't sculpt what I just talked about, the little things, because you can't see them. So you're literally depriving yourself of the ability to sculpt it. What you're seeing though is you're seeing some big shapes. You're seeing a little nose, and we're seeing some eyes as well. And we're also seeing some big shapes, like here in terms of the fur. Which is very important in terms of like the overall silhouette. And of course you should find references of the skull as well. But at least now we're starting to block in the main shapes. Now you can see that we can properly see the main volumes of our character. And if you're looking at this, there's no way you can just do the final little things because you actually can't see them. So then what we can do, we can blur it a bit less. And now you can start to see that we can find some specificity. Now we can get into more of the specific shape of the eye, particularly the placement of it. We can actually get some more information about the shape of the snout, of the nose, of everything here. So now we can get into some more specifics. And if we know this, then we're already like halfway there. And yeah, you can see some things here, but it's too blurred. You really can't see what it really is. But now we're just getting closer and closer and closer. So you can think about sculpting almost as like you're unblurring a photo. It's almost like you're starting off with an incredibly out of focus picture, and you're just getting closer and closer and closer. You're blurred by 100 pixels in the beginning, and then you start to blur it by 30, and then by 10, and then eventually you're not blurring anything at all. And that's where we're getting to now. Now you can see that we have a lot of specificity on our model. I still like to look at blurred references a little bit, like even for my final reference like this, because it still removes a lot of noise. Like if you look at this, there's a lot of information here, and I can't really sculpt this anyway. Like you see, there's a lot of color information, which really clouds my judgment, and there is a lot of very high frequency furs, which makes it just very hard to actually see what's going on. But at least now, if you were to sculpt that to this level, you can really get in like all the details you need while not being affected at all by the specific, by all the clutter, by all the specific high frequency. And now, you can go in and really get like the subtle little plane changes you want and all that. But because we built up the sculpt like this, or our imaginary sculpt, now you would get a lot more fidelity. You would start off with incredibly strong shapes, which are just getting stronger and stronger or more refined as we go along as well. You will get a lot more directionality to your fur and all that. So, but if you were to just start off like this, you can't. There is just particular in the beginning. If you're doing this for a while, you can, but particular in the beginning, there is just too much information here for you to really be able to process properly. So the process is literally deprive yourself of the ability to see it, because if you can't see it, you can't sculpt it. Then we'll jump back into ZBrush and we can check out how we can make it a little bit better for reference. So the first thing we have to do when you're looking at reference is we just have to use a basic material. Like we talked about before, this material is terrible because see how sharp the creases in the forehead is. And then we switch to something like this and see how soft it becomes suddenly. They're losing so much when we get to this stage, which means we have to exaggerate the forms. Like there is just no way about that. When we are working in ZBrush, you have to make something deeper. If you think it's going to be this deep, well, you're going to have to make it this deep. You're just going to have to make sure that everything is pushed a little bit. You'll get feedback on this, exactly how deep you have to push it whenever you take it into a render engine. Second off, we're going to have to match the lighting. So if we look at this guy, and we want to replicate, like, let's say we're using him for general reference. Maybe we want to get in some of the nice little details from him, like here, we want to get in this stuff here. And so the lighting right now is actually matching quite well. You can see on this side, the shadow is, and here the highlight is. So this works quite well. But what if the lighting is like this? Now you can see that it doesn't match at all. And now it is incredibly hard to actually match the reference. So if your reference was lit like this, well, you would have to light your reference as well, like this in ZBrush as well, because otherwise you're not going to be able to really see what's going on. And then you're wasting all your time because you are just looking at the wrong sort of reference. And now you were to take this, let's say you were to sculpt like this, and maybe you have to make it way stronger to even see what's going on. Or maybe if it's super flat, you can't actually see anything at all. And then let's make it really strong now. And then you go with something like this, and now you're seeing, oh crap, there's a really nasty ridge right here. So it's really important that when you're using reference like this, that you're at least aware that the lighting might not be ideal. So try to use the lighting to your advantage so it matches the reference as much as you can. It's also a good idea to do what this photo has done. I think this isn't just a black and white photo, but in general, try to keep your photos at least early on black and white, because then the only thing you can look at is really the shape. You really can't be distracted by anything else in terms of color. Now you can really see the subtle little shapes and all that without being affected by, maybe there's some discoloration in this photo or in here, because you can see it's darker here. So maybe there's some local values. You're just not going to be bothered by that at all. Another cool tip is that in ZBrush, you can literally overlay the entire program onto reference. So let's say we have the reference of this guy and we want to make sure they're matching. Obviously they're not because they're different characters, but we want to make sure they're matching. What we can do, we can make sure this is on the bottom. Like if we hit Control-Shift-A, then we can make sure it's on the bottom. And then we go into ZBrush. And then you see here, we have a nifty little see-through slider. And now you can actually see through it. So this is a pretty handy way of doing it. So now we can just go here and we can start to match it up, and we can actually just make sure that the features are matching. So, you can move this so it fits with his nasolabial fold and all that. So I use this actually quite a lot. Like I don't necessarily use it for like the final matching if I'm doing a likeness study or something, because then it gets a bit tricky. But in general, this is a good way of doing it, just to get some quick references in to be able to just block it out approximately. Something to be aware of though when it comes to using references like this, let's say you're doing a likeness study, you're doing an actual celebrity study or something like that. You might encounter a case where all your photos are matching perfectly to the model from different angles, and it doesn't work. It just doesn't look like it. And that's because you have to take into account the actual focus length of the camera. So this is a concept I just wasn't aware of when I started with 3D, because I didn't come from a photography background. So I had no idea what it meant by talking about focal lengths. Well, if you go into the draw menu, we just were to dock this, you can see we have different focal lengths. So if you were to hit 18 millimeter, you can see it's really extreme. If it's 85, it's really not extreme. So this changes dramatically the look of your model. So what if something is shot with an 85 millimeter? Maybe this is an 85 millimeter, who knows? Let's say it's a 50 millimeter. So it's like this, but you were to look at it from an 18 millimeter. Look how different they look. Like you're not going to be able to match these up because they look completely different. So if you're trying to actually overlay them on top of each other and work like that, you are not going to be able to work with this. So what's important is if you find a specific reference and you want to overlay it, try to figure out what focal length it was shot with. That is obviously very important or very hard to do. But if you're seeing something is shot with like an 18 millimeter, I generally try to avoid it because it's so tricky to just go between these. You can also have lens problems and all of that. And sometimes the lighting is incredibly soft or incredibly hard, which makes the features look very different. So just be aware of that. Don't just look at the reference and try to replicate it. Try to deconstruct the reference. Another thing which is very easy to oversee and overlook whenever you're looking at references is all their tiny little imperfections. Now, if you're looking at this guy, clearly he's an older guy who has a lot of weird stuff in his skin. But if you're looking at something like Beyonce or something and try and do a likeness study of her, it's really easy just to look at photos of her where she has all the fancy makeup on, and maybe you're a big fan of her, so you're trying to make her seem a lot prettier than she is. So by doing so, you're omitting a lot of the little imperfections, the asymmetries, whatever it might be, the tiny little pimples and pores and all that, how the eyes are different heights. And by doing that, you are doing yourself a massive disservice, because it's not like she's going to look like a prettier version of Beyonce. She's not going to look like Beyonce at all. She's just going to look like a different person. Maybe you can kind of see the resemblance, but you need to get in the imperfections into a character. This was something I learned when I worked on Tarzan some years ago, and we were asked to really focus on the textures. Now, this is obviously a human, but the equivalent would be that we would have to match each one of these little beard stubbles in the textures. We had to basically overlay them and just place them in very specific spots. So having a good eye for detail is essential. So if I were to sculpt this guy, let's talk quickly about how I would observe him. First, you have, of course, the general shape. You can see he's very square, like so. So let's analyze him real quick. So obviously his face is quite square, like so. So you can really analyze him like this. We can also look at more subtle shapes. If you were to just look into it, you can see here his nose is really crooked. Like I wouldn't just sculpt this in symmetry. If we were to just draw a symmetry line, like so, you see how much is on the other side. So you would really have to go in and just notice all this crookedness going on. And then we're talking about tiny imperfections like this thing you have going on. You have all these subtle little features. You have all the directionality of the pores. And if you want to do a realistic study, you're going to have to think about these things. You can't just look at his eyes and go like, all right, cool, eyes shape is kind of eye shaped, and then go from there. You have to look into the specific plane changes. You have to think about the thickness of the eyelid, how thick it actually is. You have to think about all the little shapes going like this. You have to think about how the skin works. And obviously, in the beginning, this is impossible to do. There's too much information. But as you're getting more advanced, you really need to have an incredible eye for detail. This will improve your work more than anything else. And I don't just mean like replicate what you're seeing, though that is, of course, a part of it as well. What I mean is like actually look at the plane changes. Look at this. Here, there's a clear plane change like so. This is not just like a little detail. This is an actual plane change. And you have so many subtle little plane changes. Here's a plane change because, we have a little bit of a fat deposit here. We have a little plane change right here where the wrinkle goes. And we also have some directionality to the wrinkle as well. We have two lines going down like this vertically, and they crosses in. And you have so much subtlety going on. So if you want to do realistic and natural looking studies or models, I highly recommend that this is the level of detail you go into. You properly analyze it. You don't just overlay your model and kind of sculpt it. You go in and you look into the specific volumes. Why does this work on him? Why doesn't it work? And then you keep just refining what you're looking at. And then you keep just refining your model. With this guy as well, we can also do a frequency separation. So we could take him and we could blur him a few times. So we could take this and we could filter, blur, and Gaussian blur. And we can blur this something like 24. So now what you can see is the main shapes. You can only see the main shapes. Then we could take this guy. We could blur him something like maybe 12. Something like this. And now you can start to actually get in there. And this is where a lot of magic happens when it comes to sculpting. Because now you can actually start to see a lot of the main shapes going without being distracted. This is really the level where a lot of the magic happens. This is just what we refer to mid-frequency, and we have a whole chapter dedicated to that. Because now you can properly see what's going on without any of the junk going on, without any of the really fine details obscuring your view. So now you're forced to just really look at the mid-frequency. Really looking at the nice volumes like we have here. And then we can go back to our original model, and then you can just start to see that we get a lot more definition this way. So just to sum up, reference is absolutely essential to use. You need all sorts of different reference. You need reference for doing specific things like eyes, or it could be mood board references, it could be texture references, but whatever it is, you have to figure out what the specific use case is. I used this guy for this project here, where I used him for the eyebrows, where the only thing I used from was really getting the eyebrows in here, trying to really replicate this feeling of eyebrows. I did this in Maya though, but that still counts because it's still a part of the project. And I was just really trying to replicate this. And I was straight up going in and trying to analyze the direction of it. So find specific reference for your specific needs. Then look at negative space, look at proportion, and then really try to blur the image to get the proper frequency separation. Then take it into ZBrush using PureRef, or rather overlay it on top of ZBrush with PureRef. And then try to replicate the lighting you're dealing with. Keep it simple. You don't have to do a full 3-point setup, but just making sure that the main light direction is the same. And then make sure to, of course, look at the imperfections. Really get into it and look at the tiny little imperfections, look at the asymmetries in the reference, and properly understand the reference. And then also don't use too many contradicting references. I had this problem when I was doing the eyebrows, where I was looking at this kind of eyebrow style, where it actually goes up, and then I was looking at one where it went down like this. And that just caused me to be super confused, because they were both valid references. They just were completely different in terms of the direction. They were literally opposite. One was going up and the other one was going down. So make sure that you have references which supports your idea, but which doesn't really contradict it, creating something boring in the middle.